This is Anaclea, a town in Georgia, and right next to it you can see this massive gray patch, the place where China is pushing the United States out of Georgia right now. It's taking control of a point that could be used to reroute part of global trade between Asia and Europe away from the usual corridors. If China completes what it's planning there, the West will immediately start losing control over where cargo flows, who manages that flow, and who profits from this new route. And the worst part for Washington is that China has already started a chain of events in Georgia that could make it impossible for the West to reclaim the level of control it once had over global trade. So first we need to understand what exactly the United States and China are competing for. At first glance, it seems simple. They're fighting for influence over other countries. What? That's a simple, clear answer. But that explanation is too shallow, and it doesn't really hold up. Countries by themselves don't create power. Power emerges where flows move, goods, money, resources. All of that passes through different states. If you control those flows, you can shape entire regions without even pressuring them directly. So this is less about territory and more about infrastructure. That's why the most important points become sea routes and ports. Most global trade moves through them, which means whoever controls these hubs effectively controls the system itself. I almost said the entire universe. Now let's take a closer look at ports. Even if a product has already been made and is fully ready for sale, it's not going to magically appear in the buyer's hands. It still has to be delivered through specific points along the route. You could use planes, of course, but that's far too expensive for large volumes. No one moves bulk cargo by air unless they absolutely have to. Land routes have limits too: distance, roads, borders, and in many places, weak infrastructure. At some point, that just stops becoming practical. I can get there in 2 hours, but it'll cost you a fortune. Oh no. I can get there in a week maybe, and don't forget the paperwork. All 8 boxes of it. No thanks. Now this looks like the better option. In the end, everything comes down to the sea. Oceans let you move enormous volumes of goods at a relatively low cost. That's why the bulk of global trade, more than 80%, moves by water. And that's what makes ports so critical. They're the points through which countries plug into the global economy. They're essentially gateways. Goods enter through them, and from there they move deeper into the country or onward to the next destination. It may seem like once a maritime shipping system is already in place and working, there's no real need for competition. There are established routes, ships move along them, everything feels stable, goods arrive where they need to go, and that seems good enough. But people just love making things more complicated. There's one important point that's easy to miss. Trade itself is always changing. Economies shift, politics shift with them, and the entire structure of trade flows changes too. What worked yesterday can start breaking down today. Any disruption can throw the usual system off balance. A canal gets blocked, sanctions are introduced, a port becomes overloaded and can't keep up. And that's it, companies are scrambling to find workarounds so they don't lose time or money. At the same time, new projects begin to appear, new ports, new routes, new logistics solutions. Some of them can be faster or cheaper, and part of the cargo flow gradually starts moving there instead. As a result, even older routes that once seemed reliable begin to lose market share. Cargo flows get redistributed, routes change. In other words, the whole system is constantly in motion. But what about new players? At first glance, it feels like everything has been divided up long ago. The routes are occupied, the major ports are already built into the global network, and breaking into the system from the outside seems almost impossible. Except this whole system has one weak spot. It depends on a small number of key choke points through which most goods move, and those points are under constant pressure. Take the Suez Canal or the Bosphorus, for example. Huge volumes of cargo pass through them, and problems come up there all the time. Sometimes it's delays, sometimes political risks, sometimes purely technical failures. Something's always slowing things down. And the moment one of those choke points starts malfunctioning or gets blocked altogether, global trade starts to wobble. Cargo flows have to be redirected fast. That's where a window of opportunity appears. Even relatively small changes somewhere else, a new port, a new route, upgraded infrastructure can draw part of that traffic away. Lately, a new pressure point has started to emerge on the global map, one that didn't get much attention before, but it's becoming harder to ignore. That place is Georgia. For a long time, it didn't play any major role in global trade routes, just a country. Beautiful, great wine, incredible food, But none of that really changes world trade. While the major powers focused on established ports and proven routes, Georgia stayed mostly on the sidelines. It had the geography, it had the potential, but that potential was never seriously used. But the moment the demand for alternative routes grows, attention starts shifting to places like this. And this is important to understand. This is no longer just a local thing or some small regional issue. Once Georgia starts appearing on the logistics map, it means the competition between the United States and China is moving to an entirely different level. It's no longer limited to the old hubs. And here we go. So first we need to understand why attention is shifting specifically to Georgia, even though it's a small country and not considered a major trading power. Usually, states like that don't have much influence over global trade flows. They don't have huge markets, they don't control major resources, and at first glance there seems to be nothing especially important about it. But here, the key factor is not the size of the economy, it's the geography of the country. Its territory lies along one of the shortest routes between China and Europe. And this is not just a single road, but a combined corridor. Part of the trip goes over land, part by sea. Because of that, the route is shorter than the classic option, where cargo goes the long way around through the Suez Canal and across the ocean. That's when Georgia stops looking like some distant periphery with no real impact. It starts to be seen as a transit corridor, a place through which goods can move more quickly between the world's two largest economic regions. And naturally, that gets people interested. Still, one thing doesn't make sense to me. If Georgia's so well positioned, why did this route not become important earlier? Normally, a favorable location turns into money and cargo traffic pretty quickly. But here, that never really happened. Because geography alone is not enough. For a route to work in real life, it needs solid infrastructure. You need ports that can handle large cargo volumes, railways, logistics hubs. Everything has to meet the demands of global trade. For a long time, Georgia simply didn't have that. It didn't have modern ports at the right level. It didn't have a sufficiently developed rail network, and it didn't have the connected system needed to move goods quickly and reliably. So the situation looked weird. On one hand, there was a short and potentially attractive route. On the other, it only really existed on the map. And then there was the issue with ports. Like I said, even if a route's shorter and looks more attractive, it won't start working on its own. Modern maritime trade is built on massive container ships. These vessels can carry thousands of containers in a single voyage, but they have strict requirements. They need deep water ports and high cargo handling capacity. If a port can't accommodate ships like that, it effectively drops out of the system. For major shipping lines, it might as well not exist. Listen, it's too shallow here. Relax, it'll be fine. Knew this would happen. Well, at least she brought the cargo. And that was Georgia's problem for a long time. Its ports simply didn't meet international standards. They couldn't handle the scale or the types of ships used by global shipping lines. As a result, the main trade flows passed it by, which meant Georgia had little chance of competing with already established ports and routes. And there's a reason I'm talking about this in the past tense. Things started to change when there was finally a chance to remove the main obstacle. Before that, Georgia was basically just a point on the map, not a real participant in global trade. What it was missing was a genuine port. Then the idea of building one appeared, and that changes things almost immediately. A large deepwater port is exactly what's needed to receive major container ships and handle large cargo volumes. If that happens, the main limitation effectively disappears. Georgia gets a real chance to plug into major trade routes and become a place through which part of the trade between Asia and Europe could actually move. This is where things get a little strange. If the United States really wanted control over key strategic points like this, why not build the port itself? Projects like that are usually not abandoned halfway. When infrastructure is strategic, it's normally carried through to the finish and supported for years, especially in such an important region. But in Georgia's case, somehow, it never came together. The Deepwater Port Project in Anaclea was originally launched with the participation of Georgia itself and Western investors, including American business interests. So this was never some small local venture. Major players were involved from the beginning. At first, everything looked serious. The launch happened, then there was political backing, and the project was discussed as something important for the whole region. But then something went wrong. So now what? Guess we all go home. In 2020, the project was halted. It was simply frozen, and that left a void around a key strategic point. There was no port, the infrastructure remained unfinished and the entire project was stuck in limbo. That looks especially strange when you consider how important Anaclea could have been for global trade. To understand what really happened there, you have to look a little closer at the details. For example, the financial side of the story. When a project is this important, international investors come in looking at more than just profits. They also want protection in case things go wrong. In short, the investors wanted to know who would cover the losses if the project started falling apart. In the case of the Anaclea port, that became the key issue. Investors wanted the state to take on part of the risk by offering guarantees and insurance mechanisms against potential losses. For major financial institutions, that's a standard arrangement. It helps reduce uncertainty and makes the project easier to finance. But the Georgian government refused. Officials believed those commitments could hit the state budget hard, and in the end, the sides couldn't reach an agreement. The investors wanted stronger guarantees, while the government didn't want to put public money on the line. As a result, everything stalled. The project still existed on paper, but it could no longer move forward. But even after the project was stopped, the story didn't follow the usual pattern. Normally, when the key investors leave, a project like this goes dormant for a long time, especially when it involves expensive, complex infrastructure that needs huge funding and years of work. But that didn't happen in Georgia. The country didn't give up on the idea, the project was not permanently shelved, and it wasn't written off as a failure. Instead, they started looking for a new partner, someone willing to enter the project, take on the risks, and provide financing. And before long, the focus shifted to China. Another important point is why, despite the project's obvious potential, it still failed to attract a broad group of investors. Usually, projects like this draw several major players because they promise long-term returns and control over an important trade gateway. But in this case, the risks turned out to be higher than expected. First, there was political uncertainty, and no one knew how things would evolve. Second, the government guarantees investors had asked for from the start were never granted. And on top of that, the financing terms themselves were quite complicated. All of that ended up scaring many potential investors away. People aren't eager to pour huge amounts of money into something if they aren't sure how their investment will be protected. As a result, the new tender for the Anaclea project ended up with only one fully serious bidder, a Chinese-Singaporean consortium. There was technically one more option, a European participant. It was considered and remained in the process for a while, but it never made it to the finish. A port in Georgia, huge potential. True, but no one really knows what they're getting into. So what do we do? Same as always, stay neutral. In the end, there was no real competition. The project ended up in a situation where there was hardly anyone to choose from. The real question is what that means for the project itself. Usually when there are several bidders, you can negotiate. You can compare offers, apply pressure, and choose whoever gives better terms. That creates room to maneuver. But here that room is basically gone. Georgia has very little leverage left because there's no real alternative. The investor can push for almost any terms at once. It gains major influence over how the deal is structured, how financing is used, and how the project is carried out. In the end, China gets the opportunity to shape the project around its own interests, not entirely, of course, but to a much greater extent than it could have if there had been actual competition. So if the United States hadn't pulled out, what exactly could it have gained? This was never just about building one more port, because a port like that's not just a dock with containers stacked around it, it's a key junction where major cargo flows pass through. If you control a hub like that, you gain leverage over transit between Asia and Europe. In other words, you can influence how goods move, which routes they take, and under what terms. It's also a way to secure a foothold in the corridor, not just to watch from the sidelines, but to have a physical presence at a point that handles part of global trade. At first glance, it might seem like the U.S. wouldn't lose much. The port would still get built without American involvement, the infrastructure would still exist, and access would not necessarily be denied. But that's not really the point. The real issue is who controls it. If the U.S. is not part of the project, it loses the ability to shape the rules of the game. The conditions for carriers, the tariffs that get set, and who gets priority in cargo handling. And that is a completely different level of influence. I think you already understand the difference between being an owner and being just a user. On paper, access may still be there, but real influence is gone. Now let's look at it from the other side. What exactly does China gain by entering a project like this? If you see it as just an investment, the logic seems simple enough. Put money in, earn revenue from the port's operations, Containers get processed, cargo keeps moving, and the profits come in. Maybe that would be true for some other country, but definitely not for China. For China, this is not just a standalone asset, it's another piece of a much larger system. It adds a new hub to its infrastructure network, linking key routes between regions. The Georgian port becomes part of the Belt and Road Initiative, strengthening the connection between Asia and Europe. And in the end, China gains not only revenue, but also greater control over transit. The more hubs it adds to the network, the stronger its influence over global trade becomes. And this is where an important question comes up. Is this really just about economics, or is it something much bigger and more serious? As if economics were ever a small matter? If this were only about profit and investment, the US reaction would probably be calmer and more pragmatic. But judging by what American politicians have been saying, this is about more than money. Their main concern is the growing dependence on Chinese infrastructure and on China as a whole. Well, if the US had built the port itself, then it would be the one calling the shots. That's why Washington's response has been much harsher than you might normally expect. If this were just a business deal, it would have been seen as ordinary market competition. Whoever invests the money gets the profit. But infrastructure is also a tool of influence. When one country controls key hubs, it gains leverage over the entire flow of trade. Snap! And the economy becomes a pressure tool too. But the story's not over yet. It may look like everything's already been decided. There seems to be an investor and the general direction is clear. Not quite, and here's why. Normally it happens like this. The key decisions are made and construction begins. There are deadlines, obligations, and everyone moves according to plan. But here the process just keeps dragging on and on. Even though the investor has already been chosen, the contract still has not been signed. In other words, nothing is final yet. The arrangement so far is mostly informal, and the talks are still ongoing. The sides are bargaining, clarifying details, and trying to settle disputed points. At the same time, both politics and economics continue to shape the process. Nothing has been locked in yet, and the final version of the project could still change. So nothing's actually been decided yet, right? Right. Then maybe forget the port, and let's build a water park instead. What's also interesting is that the US still has not stepped away from this project, even though it's no longer directly involved in the project. In situations like this, things are usually more straightforward. When a country loses leverage in a situation like this, it backs off, shifts its attention elsewhere, and focuses on places where it can still make an impact. But that's not what's happening here. The reason is that this is about more than a single deal. It's not just about the port, and it's not just about money, which is why the US is still hovering nearby and keeping a close eye on things. American diplomats are still traveling to Georgia, visiting the site itself, meeting with the Georgian side, and watching how the situation develops. In other words, they're doing everything they can to stay involved. And if an opportunity comes up to influence decisions that haven't been fully locked in yet, they still have a chance to do so. And by the way, if a country's still so actively involved in the process, that usually means nothing has been fully settled for it yet. So this is not just about gathering information and observing from the sidelines. The US clearly has not given up hope of influencing the outcome, and is trying to keep China from digging in too deeply and expanding its influence. We're glad to see you in our country. So are we. We're here too. Hello there. You can see it in the constant attention to the negotiations, in the contacts with Georgia, and in the various signals being sent to the Georgian side. So the struggle over this project has not gone anywhere. It's still going on, just in a different form. And what about Georgia? Its position looks like an attempt to play on the rivalry between major powers and get something out of it. When a country finds itself between several centers of power, it has a chance to bargain for better terms and attract money into its projects. I can't really blame Georgia for wanting to make the most of that. There's real upside here. More investment, faster infrastructure development, and new opportunities. But there's also another side to it. The higher the stakes, the stronger the pressure becomes. Big powers start pushing their interests more aggressively. For Georgia, that means constantly looking over its shoulder and taking both the US and China into account, while at the same time trying not to fully side with either one. Come on, tell us who's right. I am. That's nonsense. Georgia, you decide. Hey, where'd he go? In the end, the country ends up in a pretty difficult position, where any decision it makes about the project can affect everything, from the economy to politics. No wonder there's so much tension around the project. If this were just about building a port, it wouldn't trigger such intense reactions. Ordinary infrastructure projects rarely draw this much attention from major powers. A port's a port. There are plenty of them around the world. But Like I said, this is not really about the port itself, it's the location. That's what makes it such a prize. But can just one new route really affect global trade that much? To understand that, you have to look at how cargo flows actually shift. A new route doesn't need to replace the old ones overnight to change the system. The main routes through the Suez Canal and across the oceans are not going anywhere. They're still the backbone of global shipping. But part of the cargo will naturally move to whichever route proves faster and more cost-effective. That's especially true for high-value and time-sensitive goods. In that segment, delivery speed matters, and even a modest time advantage can make a real difference. Once those shipments begin moving elsewhere, the older routes start losing traffic. Fewer port calls mean less revenue for ports, less business for logistics companies, and fewer jobs. So in the end, even a relatively small shift in cargo flows can set off a chain reaction. It's like dominoes, just with ships and a lot more water. The consequences for Europe are fairly obvious too, especially when you remember how much of its economy depends on transit. Major ports and logistics hubs make money because goods keep moving through them. So the moment some of that traffic starts shifting to alternative routes, it hits their bottom line. Even a drop of just 5 to 10% is enough to hurt. Ports lose revenue, transport companies operate below capacity, and all the related services start feeling it too. Then employment begins to slip, shipping costs change, wages get squeezed. For the United States, though, this looks a little different than just a redistribution of cargo flows. At first glance, you might think, so what if some share of shipments moves elsewhere? For an economy that large, that shouldn't be a big deal. But this is not really about volume. Remember what I said about control? As long as cargo moves through the usual hubs, you retain leverage over the entire chain. As cargo flows start shifting into alternative corridors, the whole dynamic changes. The players that used to control the main choke points gradually lose that leverage, which means they have fewer ways to influence what happens. For the US and its allies, that's already turning into a strategic problem. Their grip on the Asia-Europe connection is weakening, and with it, their ability to influence global trade as a whole. So is China really in a position to take over the game? Obviously, companies are not just going to abandon old routes overnight, especially when those routes have been reliable for years. To make them switch, you have to offer a real advantage, something strong enough to justify changing a system they already trust. And that's exactly how China's approaching it. It's not trying to knock out the old routes head-on. Instead, it's building a parallel system where the terms look more attractive. New ports, railways, and entire logistics corridors are emerging. An alternative route appears, one that can move cargo faster or at a lower cost. Honestly, at that point, you can only shrug because this strategy is working. When trade routes change, the balance of influence between countries changes with them. Logistics shift, and so do the key points everyone depends on. Countries start relying on whichever hubs carry the main volume of goods, and when those hubs are controlled by other players, that starts affecting both economics and politics, because everyone has to take someone else's rules into account. With these new corridors, those rules increasingly come from China, because more and more routes are running through systems it controls. That means Europe and Asia are increasingly operating through logistics networks that are no longer under Western control. And it's probably not something you can just quickly roll back now. This goes far beyond normal competition because it's no longer just about profit. In a typical market, companies fight for customers. But here, what's really at stake is the structure of global trade itself. Like I said at the start of the video, whoever controls the ports and transport corridors has the power to influence everything. That's what I said, wasn't it? And that influence extends to governments too, because they depend on secure and stable supply chains. So in the end, this is not about one port or one investment, it's about a full-scale reshaping of global logistics. For a long time, the key routes and major hubs are mostly under Western influence. They gave Western countries steady control over trade flows. But that era is fading, because more and more projects are being built and financed by China. And the US? Well, it's clearly losing a lot, and this may be only the beginning. You owe me a like. See you later.